Blood tastes like old copper. Cade knew that better than most, but he wasn't the one bleeding. He was just trying to pay for a stale coffee at a fluorescent-soaked truck stop off Interstate 40 when he saw her. Faded yellow bruise on the jawline, trembling fingers, and then a gesture. Thumb tucked, fingers folded over, a silent scream trapped in the mundane chaos of a gas station line. He wasn't a hero. He was a hell's angel. Fluorescent lights in highway gas stations don't hum. They buzz with a sick, erratic frequency that drills right into the base of your skull. Cade stood in line, shifting his weight off his bad knee, staring at the back of a trucker's neck. His leather cut hung heavy on his shoulders, the familiar weight of the death's head patch, branding him to the world. He smelled like exhaust, 3 days of road sweat and stale tobacco. All he wanted was black coffee and a pack of Reds. 2 people stood in front of the trucker. A man and a woman. Cade wouldn't have noticed them if the man hadn't been standing so unnaturally close to her. It wasn't intimacy. It was a cage. The guy wore a crisp blue polo and khakis, the kind of aggressively normal uniform that usually melted into the background. But his hand was clamped around the woman's upper arm. His knuckles were white. The grip was burying into the cheap gray fabric of her oversized hoodie. She stared straight ahead at the racks of impulse buy candy. Her face was pale, stripped of makeup, her lips chapped and chewed raw. A shock of dark hair fell over the left side of her face, but the harsh overhead lighting was unforgiving. It caught the sickly yellowish-green edge of a fading bruise blooming along her jawbone. Cade blinked slowly, letting his heavy eyelids drag. Not your business, he told himself. He had seen enough violence in his 42 years to know when to look away. His world was built on a strict economy of force. You fought for your brothers, you fought for your territory, you fought for your pride. You didn't fight for strangers in a Sunoco in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. There was no profit in it, only police reports and complications. He rolled his shoulders, feeling the stiff leather creak, and looked down at his scuffed boots. But the air in the gas station felt thick. The guy in the polo leaned in his mouth, hovering inches from her ear. Cade couldn't hear the words over the static of the local radio station playing from a busted ceiling speaker. But he heard the tone. A low, rhythmic hiss. The cadence of someone grinding someone else down into dust. The woman shifted her weight. As she did, she turned her head just a fraction of an inch. Her eyes bypassed the trucker. They locked onto Cade. Her pupils were blown wide, swallowing the irises. It was the look of a trapped animal calculating the exact distance to the slaughterhouse door. Cade didn't change his expression. His face was a scarred, bearded mask hardened by decades of hiding his hand. He held her gaze, a cold, dead end to her silent panic. Then her right hand moved. She let it drop to her side, pressing it flat against the seam of her sweatpants where the man couldn't see. She raised her palm outward, facing Cade. She tucked her thumb into her palm. Then slowly, deliberately, she folded her forefingers down over her thumb, trapping it. She held it there for 3 agonizing seconds. Then she opened her hand and did it again. Tuck, fold, trap. Cade knew the signal. He had seen it on some grainy news broadcast playing on a muted TV in the clubhouse bar a year ago. A distress signal. Domestic violence. I need help. I can't speak. Annoyance flared hot and sharp in Cade's chest. He gritted his teeth, his jaw muscles clumping under his beard. Damn it. Why him? He was a patched member of the Hells Angels, a man who actively lived outside the bounds of polite society's laws. He was a predator to most, a ghost to the rest. He wasn't a badge. He wasn't a savior. The line shuffled forward. The trucker paid for his diesel. The man in the polo steered the woman to the counter, his grip never loosening. He paid in cash, his voice overly cheerful, practically dripping with forced geniality as he joked with the bored cashier about the humidity. The woman kept her eyes glued to the scuffed linoleum floor. Cade watched them walk toward the glass doors. He stepped up to the counter, tossing a crumpled $10 bill onto the sticky rubber mat. Coffee. The Reds. Cade grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble that sounded like an engine refusing to turn over. He didn't wait for the change. He grabbed the cigarettes and walked out into the oppressive summer heat, the automatic doors sliding shut behind him with a cheap, rattling thud. The transition from the air-conditioned chill to the heavy ozone-thick air of the parking lot hit him like a wet towel. He walked to his Harley. The chrome was dull with highway grime. He swung a heavy leg over the saddle, the suspension groaning in protest. He pulled a cigarette from the pack, stuck it between his teeth, and struck a match. The sulfur flared, pungent and sharp. He inhaled the smoke, letting it fill his lungs, buying time. He looked across the cracked asphalt. The man and the woman were walking toward a late-model silver sedan parked by the edge of the lot near a rusted-out dumpster. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for an idling 18-wheeler on the far side. Cade rested his hand on the ignition switch. One twist, one kick. He could be back on the interstate hitting 70 miles an hour, leaving this miserable pit stop and its miserable people behind in a cloud of dust and exhaust. That was the smart play. The only play. He looked at his hand. Thick fingers, knuckles swollen and scarred from a lifetime of impact. A heavy silver skull ring glinted dully in the harsh sunlight. These hands broke things. They didn't fix them. Across the lot, the man unlocked the passenger door. He didn't open it for her. He pushed her toward it. Cade didn't turn the key. He sat there, smoke drifting up into his eyes, stinging them. He hated himself for watching. He hated her for making that signal. But most of all, he hated the smug, comfortable way the man in the blue polo moved, entirely convinced he owned the world and everything breathing inside his little silver cage. The heat coming off the asphalt distorted the air, making the silver sedan shimmer like a mirage. Cade took another drag of his cigarette, the ember glowing an angry radioactive orange. He tasted cheap tobacco and the metallic tang of his own saliva. By the car, the illusion of normalcy completely fractured. The woman hesitated before getting in. It was a microscopic delay, a half-second stutter in her step, maybe just a shudder of pure dread at the thought of being sealed inside a metal box with him. The man's reaction was instantaneous. The cheerful facade he'd worn for the cashier evaporated. He grabbed the back of her neck, not a slap, but a vice-like clench of his fingers into the soft tissue right where her spine met her skull. He leaned his body weight into hers, shoving her face first toward the slanted glass of the passenger window. Cade heard the dull, sickening thump of bone hitting safety glass. It wasn't a loud noise. It wouldn't have carried over the roar of the highway if Cade hadn't been hyper-focused on them. But to Cade, it sounded like a gunshot in an empty room. The woman didn't cry out. Her silence was worse than a scream. It was the silence of a victim who knows that making noise only buys them a steeper punishment later. She simply crumpled her knees, buckling against the door panel, trying to absorb the impact. The man hissed something in her ear, his face twisted into an ugly, sneering mask of entitlement. Cade exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke. Screw it. He didn't make a conscious decision. There was no internal debate about morality or justice. It was a purely physical reaction, a dark, mechanical clicking into place, a gear shifting deep in his gut. The same violent instinct that kept him alive in bar brawls and highway run-ins was now overriding his common sense. He didn't bother putting the kickstand down. He let the heavy motorcycle lean against his thigh as he dismounted, balancing it before locking it into place. He flicked the half-smoked cigarette onto the asphalt, the cherries scattering into a dozen dying sparks. Cade began to walk. He didn't run. Running signaled panic. Running meant you were out of control. Cade walked with the slow, deliberate, heavy-footed rhythm of a natural disaster. His boots crunched against the loose gravel and discarded bottle caps of the parking lot. The heavy silver chain looped to his wallet chimed rhythmically against his denim. Clink, clink, clink. The man in the polo had the woman halfway shoved into the passenger seat when he heard the heavy footsteps. He turned his face, still flushed with adrenaline and rage, expecting to see a lost tourist asking for directions. Instead, he saw 6'2" of leather ink and bad intentions bearing down on him. Cade's face was unreadable. His dark eyes were flat dead, focused entirely on the space between the man's eyes. The rocker on the back of his vest caught the sun, broadcasting his allegiance. The man's posture shifted immediately. The predatory aggression evaporated, replaced by the instinctual alarm of a smaller animal realizing a larger predator has entered the clearing. He stepped back from the open car door, instinctively putting his hands up in a placating gesture, though his chest was still puffed out in a pathetic display of bravado. "Can I help you, buddy?" the man asked. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the tremble he was trying to hide. He attempted a tight, neighborly smile. It looked grotesque on a face that had just slammed a woman into a window. Cade didn't say a word. He didn't break stride. He crossed the remaining 10 feet and stopped just inches from the man. Up close, Cade could smell the sourness of the man's nervous sweat cutting through a cheap generic cologne. The top of the man's head barely reached Cade's chin. The woman, half sprawled in the passenger seat, froze. She looked up through the tangle of her dark hair, her breath hitching in her throat. She recognized the biker from the line. Her eyes darted from Cade's massive frame to her abuser, terrified of what the spark between them would ignite. "Hey, I asked if I could help you with something!" The man repeated, his voice rising in pitch, trying to summon an authoritative tone. He took a half step back, his heel hitting the car tire. "We're just trying to leave." Cade looked past the man, his gaze locking onto the woman in the car. The fresh red mark on her forehead was already beginning to swell, contrasting brutally with the older yellow bruise on her jaw. Slowly, Cade raised his right hand. He didn't ball it into a fist. He held it up, palm facing outward, directly toward the woman. He held her terrified gaze. He tucked his heavy scarred thumb into his palm. He folded his fingers over it. Tuck, fold, trap. He repeated the signal back to her, a silent confirmation. "I saw you. I'm here." A ragged, choking sob tore free from the woman's throat. It was the sound of a dam breaking. She scrambled backward across the center console, putting as much distance between herself and the open door as possible, her hands covering her mouth. The man in the polo whipped his head around, staring at the woman, then back at Cade. Confusion warred with rising panic. He didn't understand the hand gesture, but he understood the threat. "Hey, back off, man! Mind your own damn business!" The man barked, his voice shrill. He puffed his chest out and made a fatal mistake. He reached out and shoved Cade's chest, trying to push the biker back. It was like trying to push a concrete pillar. Cade didn't budge an inch. The man's hands slapped uselessly against the thick leather of the cut. Cade looked down at the hands resting on his chest. Then he looked back up into the man's eyes. The boredom in Cade's expression vanished, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. The quiet was over. "My business," Cade rumbled, his voice so low it vibrated in the humid air, "just changed." Violence in Cade's experience was rarely a cinematic affair. It was usually clumsy, brief, and smelled intensely of unwashed bodies and copper. He didn't throw a punch. Punching bare knuckle was a fool's game that ended with shattered metacarpals and jagged teeth embedded in your knuckles. Instead, Cade let his massive right hand drop his thick, calloused fingers, closing around the collar of the man's blue polo shirt. He grabbed the fabric and the gold chain resting beneath it, twisting his fist inward to tighten the slack. The man, a soft, manicured guy who probably spent his days drafting emails and yelling at customer service reps, gasped. The air left his lungs in a wet squeak as the collar dug into his windpipe. Cade stepped forward, using his 240 pounds of forward momentum to walk the man backward. The guy's loafers scrambled uselessly against the loose gravel, finding no purchase. His eyes bulged, the whites flashing in panic. He swung wildly, a desperate, flailing right hook that glanced off Cade's heavy leather shoulder with a pathetic smack. It felt like getting hit with a rolled-up magazine. With a sharp, guttural exhale, Cade slammed the man backward into the side of the silver sedan. The impact dented the cheap metal paneling with a hollow thud. The man's head whipped back, bouncing off the window frame. For a split second, his arms dropped to his sides, his neurological system short-circuiting from the sudden trauma. Cade didn't let go. He leaned in close. The smell of the man's expensive citrus-heavy cologne was nauseating, mixing with the sharp tang of his sweat. "Listen to me," Cade growled. His voice wasn't loud. It was a low mechanical grinding, barely audible over the distant drone of 18-wheelers downshifting on the interstate. "You breathe too loud right now, I'll snap your jaw and wire it shut myself. Understand?" The man couldn't speak. He managed a frantic, jerky nod, his hands coming up to claw uselessly at Cade's wrist. Cade held him there for 3 more seconds, letting the fear fully marinate in the guy's system. He wanted the memory of this moment to physically ache every time this worm closed his eyes. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, Cade let go and shoved him sideways. The man collapsed onto the baking asphalt, scraping his palms and knees. He huddled against the front tire, gasping for air, rubbing his reddened neck, completely broken. Cade didn't spare him another glance. He turned his attention to the open passenger door. The woman was pressed as far back against the center console as the seatbelt mechanism would allow. Her hands were covering her mouth, her chest heaving with shallow, jagged breaths. She looked at Cade, and what he saw in her eyes wasn't gratitude. It was pure, unfiltered terror. He understood why. To her, she had just traded a monster she knew for a monster she didn't. Cade knew what he looked like. He stood blocking the sun, a hulking silhouette of scarred, flesh-faded prison tattoos and filthy denim. The death's head insignia on his chest wasn't a symbol of salvation. It was a promise of brutality. He looked like the kind of man who ate glass and swept up the bloody mess with a broom made of bones. He took a half-step back, giving her space. He deliberately kept his hands open, resting them on his heavy leather belt, away from his pockets, away from any concealed steel. "He done?" Cade asked, his voice rough, pointing a thick thumb at the man weeping silently by the tire. The woman flinched at the sound of his voice. She nodded slowly, her dark hair falling across her bruised face. She swallowed hard, lowering her trembling hands. "Sarah," she whispered. It was a fragile sound, barely making it past her lips. "Cade," he replied automatically. He didn't offer a handshake. He looked past her, scanning the parking lot. The trucker on the far side was still in his cab, oblivious. The cashier inside the glass box of the store was staring at his phone. So far, no witnesses. But that wouldn't last. Cops loved truck stops. He looked back down at the man on the ground. The guy was starting to find his courage again, fueled by the humiliation of being tossed like a rag doll. "I've got your plates," the man hissed, his voice, raspy spit flying from his lips. He was digging frantically in his khaki pockets for a phone. "You're dead biker trash. I'm calling the state troopers. I'm pressing charges. Assault, battery." Cade felt the familiar dull ache in his bad knee throb. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind the exhausted reality of the situation. He was a patched Hell's Angel with 2 prior felonies. If the troopers showed up and found him standing over a bruised civilian, it wouldn't matter what hand signals Sarah had made. He'd be in zip ties before the engine block on his Harley cooled down. He looked back at Sarah. She was staring at the man's phone, the panic creeping back into her posture. She knew what happened when the police arrived. The man would put on his polite, articulate voice. He would play the victim. She would go home with him. "You got a choice to make, Sarah, and you got about 10 seconds to make it," Cade said. She looked up at him. "I leave right now, he calls the cops, you deal with the fallout." Cade laid it out flatly, no sugarcoating. "Or you walk over to that bike with me. I drop you at a diner, a bus station, a women's shelter, wherever, but you gotta move." She looked at her abuser. The man was dialing, his eyes venomous. Then she looked at the giant, greasy biker offering her a ride into the absolute unknown. It was a terrible choice, but only one of them held a guarantee of immediate pain. Sarah grabbed a frayed canvas tote bag from the floorboard. She didn't look back at the man as she swung her legs out of the car. Her cheap canvas sneakers hit the asphalt. "Hey, where do you think you're going?" the man barked, scrambling to his knees. "Get back in the car, Sarah!" She froze, instinct kicking and a lifetime of conditioning pulling her strings. Cade didn't yell. He just took one heavy step toward the man. The man scrambled backward on his hands and feet, dropping his phone in the dirt, the tough guy act, instantly evaporating. Cade turned to Sarah. He jerked his chin toward the black motorcycle waiting in the sun. "Walk," he said. The heat radiating off the chrome exhaust of the Harley was intense enough to warp the air. Sarah stood awkwardly beside the heavy machine, clutching her canvas bag to her chest like a Kevlar vest. Up close, the motorcycle smelled like hot oil, burning rubber, and a faint metallic tang of rust. Cade unclipped a spare helmet from the sissy bar. It It was a matte black three-quarter shell scuffed and chipped from years of rolling around in saddlebags. He held it out to her. She stared at it for a second before taking it. Her fingers brushed against his knuckles, and she yanked her hand back as if she'd touched a hot stove. Cade ignored the reaction. He swung his heavy leg over the saddle, settling into the worn leather seat. The suspension groaned, compressing under his weight. "Strap it tight," Cade instructed, not looking back at her. He turned the ignition switch on the tank. The red oil pressure light flickered to life. "Keep your feet on the pegs. Lean when I lean. Don't fight the bike. Hold on to my belt." Sarah awkwardly pulled the helmet over her head. It was 2 sizes too big, the padded cheek guard swallowing her bruised face. She fumbled with the D-ring strap, her hands still shaking so badly she couldn't thread the nylon webbing. Cade watched her in the mirror. He sighed, a heavy, tired sound that rumbled in his chest. He reached back, batting her hands away with rough impatience. With practiced, blunt efficiency, he threaded the strap, pulled it snug under her chin, and snapped the retaining button. "Get on," he grunted. She climbed onto the pillion pad. It was small, hard, and unforgiving. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before her hands hesitantly reached out, her fingers lightly gripping the heavy leather belt loops on the sides of his cut. Cade kicked up the heavy side stand with the heel of his boot. He hit the starter. The Harley didn't start politely. It erupted. The V-twin engine fired with a deafening percussive roar that sent a violent shudder through the entire frame. Sarah gasped, her grip on his belt tightening instinctively as the raw mechanical vibration traveled up through the seat and into her bones. It was loud enough to rattle teeth. In the periphery of the mirrors, Cade saw the man in the blue polo. He was on his feet now, phone pressed to his ear, waving his free arm, frantically screaming words, swallowed by the roar of the exhaust. Cade dropped the bike into first gear with a heavy metallic clunk. He twisted the throttle, easing the clutch out. The rear tire bit into the hot asphalt, slipping for a microsecond on a patch of loose sand before finding traction. The bike surged forward, aggressively heavy, but terrifyingly fast. They tore out of the parking lot, blowing past the idling 18-wheeler, the exhaust notes bouncing off the aluminum trailer in a rapid-fire staccato. Cade leaned hard into the slight curve of the on-ramp, merging onto Interstate 40 without bothering to check over his shoulder. He trusted the throttle to clear his path. The transition from the stagnant, suffocating heat of the gas station to the open highway was violent. The wind hit them like a physical blow. At 70 miles an hour, the air lost its humidity and became a sheer wall of pressure. Behind him, Sarah plastered herself against his back. It wasn't an embrace. It was survival. The oversized helmet buffeted violently in the wind, threatening to snap her neck. She buried her face into the thick, sun-baked leather of his vest to escape the turbulent air. Cade felt her shivering. It was over 90 degrees, the sun beating down mercilessly on the blacktop, but the adrenaline crash was turning her blood to ice. He could feel the tiny, terrified tremors vibrating against his spine, completely out of rhythm with the thrum of the engine. He didn't slow down. Speed was distance, and distance was the only currency that mattered right now. He watched the rearview mirrors, nothing but a string of minivans and commercial trucks fading into the heat shimmer behind them. No flashing lights. Not yet, anyway. They rode in absolute silence, save for the deafening roar of wind and engine. For Cade, this was his church. The sensory overload of the highway, the smell of diesel, the vibrating handlebars numbing his palms, the tunnel vision of the dotted white line was the only place his mind ever truly shut off. But today the isolation was ruined. The rigid, terrified weight on his rear fender was a glaring reminder of the mess he had just stepped into. "What the hell are you doing, old man?" he thought, his jaw clenching. He was a ghost. He moved through the world, unseen, moving product, collecting debts, riding with his brothers. He didn't play knight in shining armor. He didn't rescue damsels. Damsels came with police and questions, and a spotlight he spent his entire life avoiding. Yet when he closed his eyes against the stinging wind, he didn't see the road. He saw her pale hand pressing against her sweatpants. Tuck, fold, trap. He twisted the throttle harder, pushing the speedometer past 80. The engine screamed in protest, burning rich and hot. He needed to dump her, find a truck stop 3 counties over, hand her a $50 bill, and point her toward a Greyhound bus. That was the play. Wash his hands of it before the stink of her bad luck rubbed off on him permanently. But as they crossed the county line, the grip on his belt shifted. Sarah's hands uncurled slightly. The rigid, panicked clenching relaxed just a fraction. Slowly, hesitantly, she slid her arms around his waist, locking her hands together over his stomach. She pressed her helmet firmly against his shoulder blades, surrendering to the forward momentum. It was an act of complete, terrifying trust from a woman who had just had every ounce of trust beaten out of her. Cade exhaled slowly through his nose. The highway stretched out endlessly ahead, cutting through the dense pine forests. He shifted into top gear, the engine settling into a deep, rhythmic lope. He wasn't going to drop her at a bus station. He knew it, and that realization terrified him more than any blue lights in the rearview mirror ever could. Sweat dried tight against Cade's neck as the interstate bled into a rural 2-lane blacktop. Pine trees boxed them in on both sides, their dense canopies casting long, jagged shadows across the cracked road. The temperature dropped instantly in the timberline. The air lost its suffocating highway ozone, replaced by the heavy damp smell of crushed pine needles and rotting wood. His lower back screamed a dull, rhythmic grinding right above his belt line that he usually drowned out with cheap whiskey. He didn't check the mirrors anymore. If state troopers were coming, they'd have thrown spike strips by now. The man in the blue polo, David maybe, or John Cade, didn't care. Probably spent 20 minutes just trying to explain to the 911 dispatcher why a 240-pound biker stole his wife. The truth was too messy for a quick police response. Abusers rarely told the cops the whole story. They curated it. That gave Cade a window. At mile marker 42, he saw the flickering neon. A cinderblock roadhouse with a gravel lot completely divorced from civilization. A rusted tin sign advertised cold beer and fried catfish. 3 pickup trucks and a mud-caked sedan sat haphazardly near the entrance. No cruisers, no cameras on the eaves, just cheap beer and anonymity. Cade geared down. The Harley's exhaust popped aggressively, a staccato backfire that echoed off the trees as he pulled into the lot. The tires crunched over broken oyster shells and loose gravel. He parked around the back near a chain-link fence bordering a swampy ditch, putting the building between his bike and the road. He killed the engine. The sudden absence of the deafening roar left a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The heat radiating off the engine block immediately enveloped his legs. Cade swung his boot over the saddle, ignoring the sharp protest in his bad knee. He stepped back, giving Sarah space. She didn't move. She sat frozen on the pillion pad, her fingers still locked in a death grip around the leather loops of his cut. Her knuckles were bone white. The oversized black helmet swallowed her head, making her look like a child playing dress-up on a war machine. "We're stopping," Cade rasped. His throat was dry-coated in highway dust. Sarah flinched. Slowly, her stiff fingers uncurled. She tried to swing her leg over the seat, but her muscles cramped from tension, and the unnatural width of the bike betrayed her. Her foot caught the exhaust pipe. Cade caught her before she hit the gravel. His massive hands clamped under her armpits, lifting her effortlessly, setting her sneakers flat on the ground. She felt like a hollowed-out bird. There was no weight to her, just sharp angles and nervous tremors. He stepped back immediately, letting his arms drop. He knew his touch wasn't a comfort. Sarah reached up with shaking hands, fumbling blindly with the D-ring strap of the helmet. Her coordination was shot. The adrenaline crash was hitting her in a tidal wave, draining the blood from her face, leaving her skin a sickly, translucent gray. "Stop pulling it. You're tightening it," Cade muttered. He stepped into her space, his heavy boots crushing the gravel. He batted her hands away with the same rough efficiency he'd used before. His thick, grease-stained fingers worked the nylon webbing loose. He gripped the sides of the helmet and pulled it straight up. Her dark hair cascaded down, matted with sweat, and flattened against her skull. The harsh, late-afternoon sun hit her face, and for the first time, without the fluorescent glare of the gas station, Cade saw the real damage. The yellow bruise on her jaw was just the oldest one. A fresh, angry red welt was swelling rapidly above her left eyebrow, right where her skull had met the passenger window. The skin around her left eye was already puffing up, turning a bruised, mottled purple. A faint scratch ran down the side of her neck, disappearing beneath the collar of her oversized gray hoodie. She wasn't looking at him. She was staring at his chest, specifically at the winged death's head patch stitched over his heart. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. "Breathe," Cade ordered. It wasn't a suggestion. She squeezed her eyes shut. She dragged in a ragged breath, her chest shuddering violently, then exhaled it in a shaky hiss. "You got a wallet in that bag?" he asked, nodding toward the canvas tote dangling from her wrist. She nodded tightly. "ID, cash?" "Yes," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, broken. $30, my driver's license." $30. Cade felt a surge of cold, bitter irritation. $30 didn't even buy a decent tank of premium gas. It certainly didn't buy a new life. "All right, you wait here in the shadow. I'm going in to make sure the room's clear. Then you come straight to the back booth. Don't talk to anyone. Keep your head down." He turned away, the heavy chain on his hip clinking against his denim. He walked toward the peeling red paint of the back door, his hand instinctively brushing against the heavy folding knife clipped inside his right pocket. Inside, the roadhouse smelled exactly like Cade expected: stale cigarette smoke baked into the wood paneling, ammonia floor cleaner, and old frying oil. The air conditioning was cranked to a brutal chill, rattling the plastic vents in the ceiling. A bartender with a gray ponytail and a faded military tattoo was washing glasses behind a sticky mahogany counter. Two old men in trucker hats sat at the far end, nursing amber bottles. A waitress in a stained apron was wiping down a booth near the front window. Nobody looked up. To them, a biker walking in covered in road grime wasn't a threat. It was just Tuesday. Cade walked to the darkest corner of the room, a faux leather booth tucked behind the glow of a dusty jukebox. He slid into the seat facing the door. A tactical necessity. Never put your back to the entrance. A minute later, the back door creaked open. Sarah slipped in. She moved like a ghost, hugging the wood-paneled wall, her head ducked low. The oversized hoodie swallowed her frame. She slid into the booth opposite Cade, pressing her back flush against the vinyl, tucking her canvas bag between her knees. The waitress ambled over, slapping two laminated menus on the sticky table. She didn't offer a smile. "Coffee? Black? Leave the pot?" Cade grunted, not looking at the menu. "And a glass of ice water. Big one." The waitress popped her gum scribbled on a pad and walked away. Cade leaned back, crossing his massive arms over his chest. He studied Sarah. She was staring at the geometric pattern burnt into the formica table, completely rigid. The air conditioning was freezing the sweat on her skin, and she was shivering violently now, her teeth clicking faintly together. "Drink the water when she brings it," Cade said softly. The deep rumble of his voice seemed to startle her. "All of it. You're dehydrating. That's why you're shaking." She nodded, keeping her eyes glued to the table. "What's his name?" The question hung in the chilled air. Sarah's hands clamped together on the tabletop, her knuckles whitening again. She swallowed hard, wincing as the muscles in her bruised jaw stretched. "Richard," she rasped. "Richard what?" "Richard Vance," she whispered. Then, anticipating the next question, she added, "He's a regional manager for a logistics company. He knows people. He has money." Cade snorted softly. A regional manager. The guy probably thought a heated negotiation meant threatening to withhold a Christmas bonus. "He doesn't know me," Cade said flatly. The waitress returned, dropping a thick ceramic mug of black sludge and a sweating plastic tumbler of ice water onto the table. She slid a plastic basket of saltine crackers between them before wandering back toward the kitchen. Sarah stared at the water. Her hand trembled as she reached out, her fingers wrapping around the condensation-slick plastic. She lifted it to her mouth and took a sip. Then she started gulping. She drank the entire glass in one breathless, desperate pull, the ice clinking loudly against her teeth. When she set the empty plastic cup down, she finally looked at him. Her eyes were a pale, washed-out hazel. They were bloodshot and ringed with exhaustion, but the raw panic from the parking lot was starting to recede, replaced by a profound, hollow exhaustion. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Her voice was slightly stronger now, the water lubricating her throat. Cade reached out with thick, calloused fingers and tore open a plastic package of saltines. He slid 2 dry crackers across the table toward her. "Eat," he deflected. You're a hell's angel, she said, reading the curved rocker patch stitched into the denim underneath his leather cut. She didn't sound accusatory. She sounded deeply confused. You don't even know me? He was going to call the police. Cade took a slow, deliberate sip of the boiling black coffee. It tasted like burnt pennies and ash. He welcomed the bitterness. I saw your hand, he said simply. I didn't think anyone would know what it meant, she whispered, her voice cracking. I read about it online once. I was desperate. He was going to kill me today. She said it with a chilling, detached certainty, not a fear, a fact. Cade set the mug down heavily. The ceramic thumped against the formica. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The sheer mass of his shoulders seemed to block out the weak fluorescent lighting above them. Listen to me carefully, Sarah, he rumbled, locking his flat, dark eyes onto hers. I am not a good man. The things I do to make a living would make Richard look like a choir boy, but I operate by a code. Richard doesn't. He's a coward who hits things that can't hit back. He paused, letting the harsh truth of his nature sink in. He needed her to understand that she hadn't been rescued by a hero. She had been extracted by a predator. Piper. We are currently sitting about an hour outside his jurisdiction. Cade continued, pulling a cheap black burner phone from his interior vest pocket. He's got my plates, which means in about 12 hours, the local cops, the highway patrol, and a whole lot of very unpleasant people in my circle are going to know exactly what I did today. Sarah's eyes widened. The sliver of relief she had found in the water in the distance shattered instantly. Wait! I put you in danger, she stammered, horrified. Don't flatter yourself, Cade sneered softly, though there was no real malice in it. I put myself in this mess. Now I have to figure out how to clean it up before my club president decides I've brought unnecessary heat onto the charter. He tapped the thick plastic of the burner phone against the table. You got $30 in a canvas bag, he said, assessing her inventory with clinical coldness. No car, no phone. A busted face that screams domestic violence to any cop who looks at you. If I leave you here, Richard finds you by midnight. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. A single tear leaked out, cutting a clean track through the dust on her cheek. She knew he was right. So, Cade leaned back, crossing his arms again, the leather creaking loudly in the quiet booth. Eat the crackers, because after this coffee you and I are going off the grid. Gravel spat from the rear tire as Cade guided the heavy motorcycle off the two-lane blacktop and onto a deeply rutted logging road. The transition was brutal. The Harley suspension, built for smooth interstate cruising, bottomed out on the deep rain-washed craters of the dirt path. Every jolt shot a spike of pure, radiant heat up Cade's bad knee and directly into his lower spine. Behind him, Sarah clung tighter, her small hands digging desperately into his leather vest. She wasn't just holding on for balance anymore. She was holding on because the world was violently trying to shake her off. They rode for another 20 minutes into the dense, suffocating heart of the Pine Barrens. The canopy overhead grew so thick it strangled the late afternoon sun, casting the woods in a sickly, bruised twilight. The air here was heavy, practically chewable, thick with the smell of decomposing leaves, stagnant swamp water, and wet earth. Cade finally squeezed the clutch, letting the bike coast down a steep incline. The tree line broke, revealing a small, muddy clearing. Sitting dead center was a rusted-out single-wide trailer. The aluminum siding was oxidized and stained with decades of green mildew. Overgrown kudzu vines crawled up the metal skirt, threatening to swallow the entire structure whole. A rotting wooden porch sagged precariously near a front door, missing its screen. It wasn't a home. It was a grave for bad decisions. The club used it precisely because it looked completely abandoned. Cade kicked the heavy kickstand down into the soft mud. He didn't turn off the engine immediately, letting the V-twin rumble a steady, aggressive rhythm while he scanned the tree line. Nothing moved except a cloud of aggressive mosquitoes rising from the damp weeds. "Get off!" Cade rumbled over his shoulder. Sarah slid her leg over the seat, her canvas sneakers sinking instantly into the dark, wet soil. She swayed on her feet, the exhaustion making her limbs heavy and uncoordinated. She pulled the oversized helmet off her head, gasping for the humid air, as if she'd been suffocating. Her face was a canvas of fresh trauma. The swelling above her eye was massive now, practically sealing the lid shut in a pouch of angry purple flesh. Cade dismounted, killed the engine, and grabbed a heavy set of keys chained to his belt. He trudged toward the sagging porch, his boots sinking into the muck. "Watch the third step," he threw back over his shoulder. "Wood's rotten. It'll snap your ankle." Sarah followed in silence, carefully stepping over the splintered pine board. Cade shoved a heavy brass key into the rusted padlock securing the door. It required a violent jiggle and a hard kick to the base of the doorframe before the latch finally gave way with a screech of tortured metal. The air inside the trailer hit them like a physical wall. It smelled heavily of rat droppings, ancient dust, and the sharp chemical tang of bleach that had long since evaporated. The interior was a suffocating oven. Cade stepped inside, his heavy boots echoing on the peeling linoleum floor. He walked straight to a cracked window and shoved it open, tearing down a cobweb in the process. He pointed to a stained, floral-patterned sofa in the center of the narrow living room. "Sit," he ordered. He didn't wait to see if she obeyed. He walked down the narrow, cramped hallway, his broad shoulders practically brushing the cheap wood-paneled walls on both sides. A moment later, the deafening roar of a gasoline generator erupted from the back of the property. The bare incandescent bulb dangling from the ceiling flickered, weakly buzzed, and then locked into a harsh yellow glow. When Cade returned to the living room, Sarah was sitting exactly where he had told her, her canvas bag clutched on her lap. She looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of squalor, a bruised corporate wife dropped into the middle of a criminal's purgatory. Cade tossed a dusty olive-drab plastic box onto the cracked Formica coffee table in front of her. The white cross painted on the lid was flaking off. "Bathroom sink works. Water's brown for the first minute, but it clears up," Cade said, his voice flat. "Clean that cut on your neck. Put some ice from the freezer on your eye. Ice maker runs off the generator, should be a bag of frozen peas in there from God knows when." Sarah stared at the first aid kit. She slowly unzipped her canvas bag and pulled out a single crumpled tissue, dabbing at her swollen eye. "How long do we have to stay in this place?" she asked. Her voice was hollow, devoid of any demanding tone. It was the question of an exhausted prisoner trying to gauge the length of their sentence. Cade walked into the tiny, grease-stained kitchen. He opened a high cabinet, ignoring the scurry of a cockroach darting behind a rusted can of beans. He pulled down a bottle of cheap, unlabeled amber whiskey. "Until I figure out how much heat your husband brought down on my head," Cade said, unscrewing the cap. He didn't bother with a glass. He took a long, punishing pull directly from the bottle. The cheap liquor burned a violent path down his throat, momentarily numbing the ache in his spine. "He's not my husband," Sarah said quietly. Cade paused, the bottle still hovering near his mouth. He looked at her over the kitchen peninsula. "Fiancé, then?" Cade grunted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Boyfriend, whatever." "He's nothing," she corrected, her voice hardening just a fraction. The sheer exhaustion was peeling away the layers of her polite, conditioned panic, exposing a raw, terrified anger underneath. "He's just the man who owns the house I sleep in." Cade set the bottle down with a heavy thud. He didn't offer sympathy. Empathy was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. He pulled the black burner phone from his cut. "Go clean your face, Sarah. I need to make a call." Night in the deep pines didn't fall. It crashed. The darkness outside the trailer windows was absolute, thick and impenetrable, pressing against the cheap glass like a physical weight. The only sounds were the aggressive mechanical rattling of the generator out back and the deafening chorus of cicadas screaming in the humid air. Cade sat at the rusted kitchen table, his massive frame hunched over the cheap wood veneer. The burner phone was pressed tight to his ear. He traced the heavy silver skull ring on his right hand with his left thumb, a nervous tick he'd never fully managed to kill. Static hissed violently through the tiny speaker. Cell reception out here was garbage, bouncing off distant towers and dying in the thick tree canopy. "You're a stupid son of a bitch, Cade. You know that, right?" The voice on the other end belonged to Jax, the club's sergeant-at-arms. Jax wasn't a man given to hyperbole. If Jax sounded stressed, the world was actively burning down. "Give me the damage, Jax," Cade growled, keeping his voice low so it wouldn't carry down the narrow hallway to the bathroom. D. Damage, Jax barked a humorless, ragged laugh. The damage is statewide, brother. You didn't just punch out some civilian. You took a woman, broad daylight. The guy called it in before your exhaust note even faded, gave them your plates, described your cut, your painted Cade, smeared all over the local dispatch. Cade's jaw tightened, the muscles in his neck strained against his collar. It was domestic. He was beating her in the parking lot. He was going to kill her. I don't give a damn if he was sacrificing her to a pagan god. Jax roared the audio clipping into harsh distortion. We aren't the police. We don't intervene. That's the rule. And now you've made us the target. The guy you hit, Richard? He's not just a suit. He called the county sheriff directly. On his personal cell. A cold, heavy rock settled at the very bottom of Cade's stomach. The cheap whiskey he drank suddenly threatened to come back up. Sheriff, Cade repeated softly. Yeah. Turns out Richard plays golf with the county boys, donates heavily to the re-election funds. The call didn't go out as a domestic dispute, Cade. It went out as an armed kidnapping by a patched Hell's Angel. They're spinning it that you pulled a gun on him and stole his property. Cade closed his eyes. Armed kidnapping. That was a federal trigger. That brought the FBI. That brought RICO charges down on the entire charter. The club president wouldn't just strip Cade's patch for this. He would hand Cade over to the cops wrapped in a bow to save the rest of the brothers. Where are you? Jax asked, his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy register. I'm handling it, Cade lied seamlessly. Don't lie to me, brother. If you're at the swamp box, you need to bounce. The president is calling a table. They're going to vote on you tonight. If they vote to burn you, I can't stop them. I know, Cade said. Buy me 12 hours, Jax. He didn't wait for a response. He crushed his thumb down on the end call button and immediately popped the plastic back off the phone, snapping the SIM card in half with his thick fingers. He tossed the pieces onto the table. He sat in the oppressive heat, staring at the shattered plastic. He had crossed the invisible line, and now he was entirely alone in the dark. He's connected. Cade's head snapped up. Sarah was standing at the edge of the kitchen. She had scrubbed the dried blood from her face, but the water had only highlighted the severity of the bruising. She held a plastic bag of frozen corn pressed against her swollen eye. She looked like a battered ghost under the flickering yellow bulb. You were listening? Cade stated, not a question. It's a small trailer, she replied, her voice eerily calm. I told you he had money. I didn't tell you how he spends it. She walked slowly to the table and sat opposite him, wincing as the cheap metal chair scraped against the linoleum. Issue. His brother-in-law is a captain in the state police, Sarah said, laying the cards out flat. He buys their silence. When he broke my collarbone last year, the responding officers had a beer with him on the porch while I was loaded into the ambulance. They wrote it up as a clumsy fall down the stairs. Cade stared at her. The cynical, hardened part of his brain, the part that kept him alive for 42 years, was screaming at him to put a bullet in the Harley's ignition, leave her in the trailer, and disappear into Mexico. He reported it as an armed kidnapping. Cade told her, watching her reaction closely. Sarah didn't flinch. She just nodded slowly as if confirming a mathematical equation she had already solved in her head. Because if it's a kidnapping, the police won't look at him. They'll just look for you, and when they find you, they won't ask questions. They'll shoot you, and they'll bring me back to him. She set the bag of frozen corn on the table. The plastic was sweating, leaving a puddle of condensation on the wood. She leaned forward, ignoring the pain in her ribs. You can't take me back, Cade, she said. The terror was gone. In its place was a terrifying, hollowed-out resolve. If you take me back or if you leave me here for him to find, make sure you kill me first. I'm not getting back in a car with him. Cade looked at the bruised, broken woman sitting across from him. She wasn't asking for a savior anymore. She was asking for an executioner. He pushed his chair back. The metal legs screeched. He walked over to the sagging floral sofa reached underneath and pulled out a heavy black canvas duffel bag hidden deep in the rotting frame. He unzipped it. The smell of gun oil and cold steel cut through the musty air of the trailer. He pulled out a heavy matte black .45 caliber pistol and a handful of loaded magazines. He slammed a magazine into the grip with a harsh metallic clack that echoed like a thunderclap in the small room. "I'm not killing you, Sarah," Cade said, racking the slide, chambering around. His eyes were flat dead, devoid of any hesitation. "And you're not going back. We're going to fix the root of the problem." Suburban streets at 3 in the morning smell like damp mulch and quiet entitlement. Transitioning from the rotting pine barrens to the manicured grid of Oak Creek was jarring. No crickets here, just the synchronized hum of central air conditioning behind privacy fences. Cade killed the Harley's engine a block away, letting the heavy machine coast in neutral. Tires hissed softly over smooth asphalt until he eased into the shadow of a massive oak. He dropped the kickstand. The sharp metallic click felt too loud for this sterile neighborhood. "Which one?" Cade whispered. Sarah slid off boots, silent on the damp grass. She pointed a trembling finger. "Third on the left, the gray Colonial. He parks in the garage." Cade checked the chamber of his .45, the slide scraping heavily, and tucked it into his waistband. He wasn't here for a murder charge. Killing Richard meant the state police in his own club would never stop hunting him. He needed a surgical extraction to cancel the manhunt. "Keep behind me," Cade ordered. They moved across dewy lawns. Cade's bad knee throbbed a dull rhythm, reminding him of years grinding down cartilage. He ignored it, focusing on the damp grass and the faint flickering glow of a television through the Colonial's sheer curtains. Richard was awake. Cade bypassed the front door's heavy security, moving to the side gate. He reached over the cedar slats and flipped the simple metal latch. They slipped into the backyard, breathing the heavy scent of chlorine from a kidney-shaped pool. The back patio door was standard sliding glass. Cade wedged a flat steel pry bar against the locking mechanism, applied 200 pounds of downward leverage, and popped the cheap lock with a sharp snap. He slid the glass open. The overconditioned air rolled out, smelling of vanilla candles and stale bourbon. Cade stepped inside, drawing the pistol. The living room was bathed in the blue glow of a massive flat screen. Richard sat on a pristine white leather sectional, an ice pack pressed to his swollen throat, a glass of amber liquid in his other hand. In a gray undershirt, he looked pathetic and small. Cade crossed the plush carpet in 3 massive strides. Before Richard could register the shadow, Cade's calloused hand clamped over his mouth, violently pinning his head against the leather. The ice pack dropped, and the bourbon glass shattered on the hardwood. Richard's eyes blew wide, bloodshot with pure panic. He thrashed his manicured hands, clawing desperately at Cade's forearm, like trying to move a steel beam. "You scream, I break your neck," Cade growled, pressing the cold steel of the .45 against Richard's temple. "Nod." Richard squeezed his eyes shut, nodding frantically. Cade slowly removed his hand, keeping the muzzle pressed hard against his skull. "You called the sheriff," Cade said softly. "You told them I pulled a gun. You stole her." Richard choked, his voice a ragged whisper. The bravado from earlier had completely evaporated. "I didn't steal anything," a voice said from the shadows. Sarah stepped into the television's blue light. The bruising on her face was a ghastly tapestry of purple and yellow under the harsh LED glow. "Sarah, what are you doing?" "He's a criminal." "Come here," Richard said, a pathetic reflex to reassert dominance. Sarah didn't move. She stood beside Cade, staring down at the man who had built her violent cage. She didn't look scared anymore, just profoundly tired. "The wall safe in your home office, Richard," Sarah said, her voice flat, devoid of any tremble. "The one behind the framed degree." Richard's face drained of whatever color was left. "Sarah, no. You use your company's network to move goods for an Atlanta cartel," Sarah stated flatly. "He keeps a physical ledger and flash drives in that safe. He bragged about it drunk. There's also about $60,000 in cash." Cade raised an eyebrow, a corporate suit playing middleman for a cartel. The sheriff connection suddenly made sense. "Get up," Cade ordered, digging the gun barrel in deeper. They marched Richard down the hall to the study, smelling of lemon polish and unread leather-bound books. Under the pistol's threat, Richard punched the code with shaking fingers. The steel door clicked open. Cade shoved him aside, emptying the contents into Sarah's tote. Stacks of hundreds, passports, a black velvet pouch of flash drives. Cade tossed the burner phone onto Richard's lap. "How you survived tonight," Cade instructed a low hum. "Call your brother-in-law. Tell him your fiancée had a mental break. She stole your car, you argued at a truck stop, and a biker broke it up. No gun, no kidnapping. She came home packed and left." Richard stared at the phone. "They won't believe that." "They will if the alternative is the DEA, getting your cartel logistics," Sarah interrupted. "Call off the police. Never look for me. If I ever see your face or if this biker gets pulled over for a broken taillight, those drives go federal." Richard looked at the empty safe. Defeat crashed over him. He picked up the phone, hands shaking as he dialed. 10 minutes later, the call was made. The kidnapping charge was a hysterical mistake. The police were standing down. Cade and Sarah walked out the front door, leaving it wide open to the humid night air. By dawn, the sky was a bruised purple. Cade pulled the Harley into a desolate Greyhound station 3 counties away. Diesel exhaust and stale coffee hung heavy in the damp air. Sarah climbed off stiff from the cold ride, but standing taller. The crushing weight was gone. She clutched the canvas tote holding $60,000 and a new life. She looked at the giant battered man sitting on the motorcycle, the man who wasn't a hero but who had given her the matches to burn her old life down. "Thank you," she whispered. It wasn't enough, but it was everything. Cade didn't smile. He gave a single brief nod, his face an unreadable mask of scarred leather and exhaustion. "Keep your head down, Sarah," Cade rumbled. He hit the starter. The V-twin erupted. He dropped it into gear and rolled back onto the highway, disappearing into the endless gray ribbon of the road, just another ghost running from the sun. Sometimes survival isn't about finding a white knight. It's about finding someone willing to walk through the dirt with you. Cade and Sarah's story proves that the darkest corners of the world occasionally hold the fiercest protectors. If this raw, gritty journey kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more intense, grounded stories. Don't forget to share this video with anyone who loves a narrative where the anti-hero changes everything. Drop a comment below. Did Sarah make the right call with the flash drives? Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next one.